It is my distinct pleasure, and I got to sit next to her. What a fascinating lady. And our table started asking all kinds of questions. I told them to save the questions because there's a Q&A after her presentation. So you will have an opportunity to write your thoughts, your questions down. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to welcome the Director of Veterinary Affairs from the Fear-Free program, Dr. Jennifer Merlo.
Really excited to be here today. Want to just start off by saying thank you to the Michigan Pet Alliance for inviting me to speak today. For those that don't know a little bit about Fear-Free, I'm going to kind of introduce it now, and we'll talk a little bit more about it. But Fear-Free is an education organization, and our goal is to educate veterinary professionals and pet professionals, as well as pet owners, about the fact that pets have emotional well-being just as well as we do. So pets experience what we call FAS, fear, anxiety, and stress. And our goal is to reduce that and alleviate it when we encounter it. I do want to start off with just a conflict of interest disclaimer. I went to The Ohio State University. I'm sorry. I know. And Tim and I were having a conversation about where the came from, because apparently there's so many Ohio State universities that we have to set ourselves apart by saying the one and only Ohio State University. So I am a Buckeye through and through. I know. Do you want me to go? I can. Okay. I joked before I came. I told my husband I was going to wear all my Buckeye gear on the plane. He said that that was not a good idea. So I am here without it. Raise of hands, who has taken a Fear-Free program, shelter or otherwise? Wonderful. That makes me happy. I can report back to my leadership that the room had mostly hands up. So I do want to tell you guys a little bit about myself, because I'm sure you're wondering why I'm here. Give you a little bit of a backstory on me. So I'm originally from New Jersey. I'm not actually from Ohio, if that makes me any better. Woohoo! East Coasters? All right. I'm originally from New Jersey. I went to the University of Delaware for my undergrad. So if there's any blue hens in the room. I went to two schools that have very interesting mascots, a blue hen and a poisonous nut. So it's a kind of interesting choice on my part. Went to the University of Delaware and then went to that school that we talked about already for my vet school degree. I graduated from vet school in 2004. And when I graduated, I was mostly focused on working on horses. So did a couple of years of horse work and did some extra training in ultrasound and internal medicine at North Carolina State University, which is what brought me down to the Carolinas, which is where I live now. I have not been back to New Jersey in many, many years. I've lost my accent somewhere along the way, unless I get angry or have had too many cocktails. So one way or the other, that's the only time the accent comes out. My husband sees it in those two ways. Hopefully, exactly. So when I moved to the Charlotte area, I transitioned into small animal practice and practiced for about 17 years in Charlotte in different aspects of veterinary care, small animal general practice, emergency medicine, and then ended up around 2016, 2017, getting the idea of owning my own practice. And that was also around the time that Marty Becker developed and put out Fear-Free. And Fear-Free was something that I had always been doing in a way, but didn't have a name for it or a way to really educate people about it. I really got very, very passionate about Fear-Free. It really reignited what I was doing as a veterinarian. And so when I opened my own practice, it of course was a Fear-Free practice. Spent a couple of years as a practice owner, then transitioned out of that and came to Fear-Free about 3 years ago. I'm not here today as a veterinarian, though. I'm not here to talk about the diseases that come from chronic stress that pets are exposed to. I'm not going to sit here and talk about the best sedation protocol to use for a pet that's very anxious and fearful. I'm here today to talk about the human-animal bond, really, at its core. Every person in this room works with animals. Why? Because we love them, right? That's always a good answer. They need us, right? And I think we want to advocate for something that can't advocate for itself, right? I love that you said we love them because I sit on the review board for applications for incoming veterinary classes at Ohio State. And I still chuckle every time I read an application that says I want to be a veterinarian because I love animals. We all love animals. It's the bond that draws us in that creates that love between the two of us, right? As animal care professionals, whether we're working in a shelter setting or in an animal control setting or even in a veterinary setting, our goal is to advocate, to create, and protect that human-animal bond. So today, I really want to talk about how behavior is a symptom of an underlying issue. That underlying issue is created when the brain of a pet is exposed to a stressor. And it's a symptom that can affect their life long after that stressor is gone. And how we can utilize some techniques from Fear Free to decrease that stress and ultimately remove those changes in behavior and affect their life long after they leave the shelter. So this statistic is probably nothing new to anybody in this room, but up to 20% of animals that are adopted are returned to the shelters. So that's 1 in 5 of animals that are placed from a facility are going to come back. And that's just the ones that come back to the shelter. Some studies report that up to 60% of adopted pets are not in those homes within 6 months after they're adopted. And what's the number one reason that pets get returned to the shelter? Behavior, right? Some behavior that the adopted owner finds in their mind intolerable. Stress impacts pets within the shelter setting daily. And often these stressors are things that we can alleviate or mitigate by making some changes in their environment. That's my little beagle dog there. Her name is Delilah. Delilah found me. We live in the country in the Carolinas, and she wandered up through the woods. I assume she was a hunting dog at some point, but she made her way to my house. Boy, did she find the right house to come to. Because, of course, she wasn't spayed, and she has seizures, and she's got all sorts of other issues. So I had the big neon sign on my house that said, hey, come here. But that's Delilah. We love her dearly. So we're going to talk a little bit about what stress looks like in pets in the shelter. We're going to talk about what are some things that you can implement within the shelter setting to help with that. And then we're going to talk about what does this do for their adoption success in the long run. The Association of Shelter Veterinarians published the original guidelines for the standards of animal care in a shelter setting in 2010. And since then, those guidelines have evolved to incorporate not just physical well-being, but emotional well-being as well. They stand by the guiding principle that meeting each animal's physical and emotional needs is the fundamental obligation of a shelter, regardless of the mission of the organization or the challenges involved in meeting those needs. And Fear Free really aligns with that mission. It's really important that I make it clear that Fear Free understands that no matter the size of the shelter, the financial status, the footprint, or resources, that there's a way to involve fear-free techniques into anything that is done on a daily basis. And that the emotional well-being of those pets that are housed there is just as important as their physical care. If we think about ourselves, we know that emotionally happy and healthy people are more likely to be outgoing and doing things and being involved with other people. Same thing for pets. If they're emotionally and physically happy and healthy, they're more likely to be adopted and find long-lasting, forever homes. So what does it mean to be healthy? As I said, it's more than just what your body is doing. We have to be sound in mind, body, and spirit. Emotionally healthy animals are content and they're active. They're displaying a wide variety of normal behaviors that we would expect them to show. That might include appropriate socialization, things as simple as eating, drinking, resting comfortably, grooming themselves. The emotional needs of individual animals are going to vary just like they do with us, dependent on unique personalities. And often we can tell how healthy and emotionally happy a pet is by observing their behaviors, or even more so, observing for a lack of behavior. And this was going to work so well, but oh well. So, audience participation time. So what stressors do animals experience when they go into a shelter setting? Noise. Strangers. Smells. What's that? Lack of exercise. Lack of mental stimulation. Love it. All of that. Yep. What? So yeah. Illnesses, captivity, transport, lack of socialization, strangers, change in their environment, change in their routine, handling, sounds, smells, crowding, all of those things are going to affect them, and it's instantaneous when they go into that environment. All right, this is my only doctorly slide the entire time, promise. I couldn't get through this talk without talking a little bit about the science behind stress and what happens to our bodies. So in the most simplistic terms, when the body encounters a stressor, the brain, specifically the hypothalamus in the brain, is going to secrete two different hormones. The first being cortisol-releasing hormone, and the second being adrenocorticotropic hormone. Those two hormones are released, and they tell the adrenal glands, which are tiny little glands by your kidneys, to release cortisol. And cortisol is your stress hormone. It's your fight or flight hormone. So that's going to have multiple effects on the rest of the body. We're going to see changes within the lungs, which is going to cause increased respiratory rate and effort. So we're going to see animals that are panting and having much more increased effort to get breath. We're going to see blood pulling away from the GI tract, because when the body is exposed to stress, the last thing it's thinking about is digesting that last meal. We're going to see blood shifting away from the brain, so we get a lack of cognitive function. They're not thinking as clearly. The liver is going to start to produce excess glucose, just in case the body needs a surge of energy to run away from whatever is causing its stress at that moment. And we're going to see blood vessels in the body start to constrict, and that's why we get that elevated heart rate and your blood pressure goes up when you're stressed. It's important to note that stress is not necessarily a bad thing, right? Knowing that something is a stressor is what helps animals avoid danger. It's that fight or flight mechanism, so that they know there's a predator coming my way, I have to leave. But normally, the body can adjust to that. However, when we have chronic stress, or what we call stressor stacking, when we have multiple things, one on top of another, the body can't adjust to that. And we get these long-term effects of stress within the body. We know that long-term stress is going to have an effect on the immune system. And so pets that are under chronic long-term stress are more likely to develop infections. We know that with GI issues, we're going to start to see chronic bowel disease, chronic GI upset, and ulceration occur. And then ultimately, as pets try to adapt to their stressful environment, they develop behaviors to cope. And that's what adopters see that they determine to be intolerable. So that was it. That was the only doctorly slide. Hopefully it wasn't too boring. So what does it look like when a human is stressed? How do we recognize stress in other people? I can tell you, I know when my partner is stressed. It's pretty obvious to us because that's what we are. We are humans. We know how to identify that in each other. But can we identify it in the pets that we're working with? The FAS scale was developed by boarded veterinary behaviorists to educate pet care professionals and give them a quantitative and a qualitative way to describe stress in pets. Prior to using the FAS scale, how did we describe pets that were acting stressed in a situation? Aggressive, right? Fractious. I know in the veterinary field, they would get a red sticker on their chart, and that was like caution, right? Feral, yes. So those are describing words that give us no information, right? And it also sets a mindset. If you've ever talked to a pet owner whose pet has been described as aggressive, bad, use caution, fractious, there's a sense of shame and there's a sense of embarrassment about, oh my gosh, my pet is bad. And they're not bad, they're fearful. So this FAS scale was developed so that we could really figure out what this pet is doing and what they're trying to tell us. And it's a gradient scale, it's a sliding scale. I always say fear, anxiety, and stress is something that kind of is fluid throughout moments of time. Just like in the veterinary world, we monitor things like anesthesia levels and heart rate and temperature throughout procedures. Fear, anxiety, and stress scale should be monitored throughout the whole time a pet is being worked with. Or in the case of a shelter setting, the entire time that they're in the shelter, they should be constantly evaluated. What is their FAS score like that day? Now, it's really easy to identify the really stressed dog or cat, right? If I put a picture up here of a cat like swatting through a carrier, hissing, there's not a person in this room who's not going to say, ooh, that cat is stressed. But we'll see in some videos there are some more subtle ways that they show up, and those are the ones that are often missed. So things as easy as yawning inappropriately can be a sign of stress. Constantly looking around for an escape route is a sign of stress. One of the things we'll talk about is feigning sleep, so pretending to be sleeping in a shelter environment when they're not really, is a good sign of stress, especially in cats. These scales are downloadable, they're free on our site. So if it's something that you think would be helpful in your facility, in your rescue work, in the animal control situation, I encourage you go to fear-free shelters and download it. It can be really helpful. First impressions are important. I gave you an impression of me in the first couple seconds, and apparently I need to go back to a different state. But stress can be imprinted in an animal or person within seconds of an experience. So we're going to watch a video, and as we're doing that, I want you to think about two things. One, what are the first impressions that these animals must be feeling? And two, think about what you're feeling as you watch the video. All right, audience participation time again. So what are we noticing when we watch that video? Poor babies, right? So let's start with what did you feel watching that video? Prison. Stressed.
I hate it.
You hate it. Hate's a strong word, so I like it. Hate it. It's gray, right? Everything's gray. I was stressed watching this video. Like I could feel myself get tense watching this video. So what are the immediate things that jump out at you about this video that you would identify as stressors for these pets? Dogs and cats together, right? Noise level. That's the first thing, right, as soon as the video starts playing. I can tell you that would wear on me in about 15 seconds of being in that room. What else? Yeah, did those cats look comfortable in any way, shape, or form? No. Do those dogs look comfortable? Does anybody in that situation look comfortable? No. So we can all agree that that is a stressful situation, and we can imagine how those animals are feeling. We identified it. There's commingling of species, right? There's loud noises. The housing isn't exactly comfortable. I can only imagine that it probably doesn't smell that great in that area, right? The lights are really bright. It's uncomfortable for them. One thing I want to point out is that there's this concept of emotional contagion, where emotions from one being can shift the emotions of another being that are in the area. Think about your own experiences. If you walk into a room that's full of people who are jovial and laughing, what happens to your immediate feelings inside? You kind of perk up, right? That kind of lifts you up. If you walk into a room where the mood is down and you can feel tension in the air, what happens to your emotions? They shift. The same thing happens with animals. So it just takes one animal being stressed to kind of shift the whole feeling in that room. And it can work the other way too. If we make it comfortable and the animals in that area are feeling good, when we introduce a new animal into it, their emotions are going to kind of come up to match that. Come on. Sorry, I'm marking off two things at the same time. So as we talked about, immediately upon admission, dogs and cats are faced with a multitude of stressors. So in the short term, we can see things like separation issues. We can see things like situational fears. But in the long term, we're going to see more profound behavioral problems that are going to lead to chronic illnesses and likely impact the likelihood of that pet being adopted. So when pets are confined for long periods of time, we get a very strong emotional reaction in them. And it can look like freezing in place. For cats, more often, it's going to look like all of a sudden they're accepting what's happening to them, or they're tolerating what's happening to them. And that often gets misinterpreted that this cat is okay with the situation. We have to make sure that we are tuned into those subtle changes that the pets are showing us so that we can adjust their surroundings. It's really important, as I talked about, to remember that their day-to-day routine has become unpredictable and foreign. And we want to try to reduce, again, that FAS that's occurring so that we don't get those undesirable behaviors, and so that the pets aren't labeled as having problematic, inappropriate, or intolerable behaviors. So communication is always occurring around us. We break it down into verbal and nonverbal. Our pets give us passive or active communication back at us. But if we pay attention to the things going on around us, we can definitely interpret some things and then respond accordingly. So let's take a look at two separate pictures and tell me what you think is going on in this picture. What can we say about the two individuals in this picture? So I don't think it's too far to guess that the person in the lighter colored shirt is uncomfortable in this situation, right? I don't think there's too many of us who would look at this and say they're both very happy. You know, that person is slouching. I get the impression that they're kind of crouched down, almost like hiding inside of themselves, right? Their face looks very tight and drawn. They're not making eye contact. So we can gather from that, without hearing any words of what's happening, that that person is uncomfortable. The other person is oblivious and apparently very comfortable. Now, what about this picture? This is a species we can interpret a little bit better, right? What do we say about this interaction? Comfortable, not comfortable? Comfortable, right? Cat looks pretty, for the most part, pretty happy. Seeking attention, kind of leaning towards the person, tail is up. Pretty happy cat. It's really important that we pay attention to those active and passive communication cues that our animals are telling us about. I talked about the fact that we can see a lack of behavior as a sign of stress. And sometimes we're too busy looking for a behavior to occur that we forget that if it's not occurring, that's as big of a deal to us. Happy animals, emotionally happy animals, are going to do the things that they normally should do. So what does that look like for a cat? What do we want to see a cat doing in a shelter setting or a confinement setting that makes us say they're fairly comfortable. Eating, drinking, grooming, not hiding. Using a litter box, right? Maybe even showing interest in scratching, playing, doing some normal cat behaviors. What about a dog? They're a little bit easier, right? Similar stuff. Eating, drinking, playing, right? Soliciting attention. So when they're not doing those things, we have to be just as cued in as to when we see an animal that's acting aggressive or hissing or hiding. They're telling you just as much by not doing it as if they were doing something that we would consider to be an abnormal behavior. FAS and frustration are serious emotional problems that face shelter animals. And oftentimes, we label animals instead of addressing what's happening around them that can undo these behavior changes. So I mentioned frustration. And frustration is an interesting emotional impact on pets. And that's when they have FAS going on, so they're fearful, they're stressed, they're anxious about something, but they're also having some positive emotions at the same time, and they don't know which of the two they should do more. And it can lead to a lot of underlying emotional conflict for them. Again, all the things that we talked about as being stressors can bring on frustration. One of the big ones that we see in shelter environments is the presence of a barrier to that pet, right? And this is most often seen in dogs because they can't get to what they would like to get to. Whether they want to get to it for a good reason or not, that's left to be figured out. But there's that barrier, and that creates frustration and emotional conflict for them. We're going to watch a short video. And this is a great example of a dog who's expressing frustration and this emotional conflict. So we'll watch it and then we'll kind of discuss what we saw.
She looks like a ladybird. Ladybird, 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 ladybird. You a puppy? Baby. He's a good puppy. He's a good cat.
So what did we see in that video with that dog? Lip licking. Fidgety. Flinch. Whale eye. Yeah, so lots of signs of stress, right? We can pick up on those. But did you notice she wants to approach the person at the kennel door, right? She's interested. Her name's Ladybird, so I know it's a she. She wants to come up to the door. In fact, she even goes and sniffs. But she keeps her body kind of leaning back, right? She's confused, she's conflicted, she's fearful. She's one that potential adopters could say, oh, she's a little bit skittish, I don't know. But if we made her more comfortable, if we could change her environment to reduce her stress, would some of those skittish, fidgety, whale eye, kind of pulling away behaviors change? And now she's very happy to go to the front of the cage and meet that person, and that potential adopter has a whole different view of that dog. Really good that you guys picked up on some of those subtle cues. That's awesome.
How long was that dog there?
I can't answer that question for you. As I tell some people, I can find out the answer. Get back to you. So pets entering the shelter environment, we've said it time and time again, chronic stress, they have fear. And sometimes that can display itself in overwhelming trembling and cowering and hiding, and some of the signs that we see in a very fearful dog. Other dogs respond with what we call fear-induced aggression, right? So those dogs take it to the other end of the spectrum, where they're acting very aggressive, not because they're quote, bad dogs or mean dogs, but because they're so overcome with fear that they don't know how to react to it or what to do with that emotion. The interesting thing is that the study showed that a lot of these dogs acted completely differently if you took them out of that environment and put them in an environment where they were more comfortable. That all of that aggression went away. But how do you do that in a setting where they're stressful, right? That's where we have to change the environment around them because these dogs could be misinterpreted. This is Casper. Casper's also conflicted. What do we see in Casper? He does not like paparazzi. This is very true. He does not want his picture taken today. So the one thing that I picked up on Casper, and I don't know if anybody else saw, but what was his tail doing? So one thing I taught all of my kids was a wagging tail does not equal a happy dog. And how often is that misinterpreted? Always. Right? He's wagging his tail. He's at the front of the cage, but he's not happy, right? He's fearful. He's showing us all the signs that he has fear. Unfortunately, he has some other predisposing factors there, and because of the breed that he is, he probably would get labeled as aggressive, but he's fearful. And it would be interesting to see what he is like outside of that barrier setting, to see what he's really like. Similarly, so I said I'm not here to talk about diseases, so we're going to ignore the fact that this dog needs some help in some other areas of its life. But again, a dog who's very conflicted between two emotions that she's feeling. She wants to go and see what's going on at the front of her kennel, but she's so scared that she retreats and runs away and starts barking in a more aggressive manner. So cats are not small dogs, and they do everything differently. They are more passive communicators. Dogs are very active in their communication to us. I own a beagle, I can tell you they're very active communicators. Cats are different. We need to train ourselves to pick up on their cues, as we talked about, that are going to tell us that they're not okay with the environment that they're in. And for some, this is going to look like they're okay with it, which is where it gets a little bit tricky. So we're going to look at this cat.
Good job.
All right, where are my cat people? Lip licking, I heard lip licking. Whiskers forward. Dilated eyes. Looking around. Yep. What's that? Hypervigilant. Yep, hypervigilant. Looking for that escape route, right? And originally, when we start the video, he looks kind of like he's a little bit interested. Starts to come out from his carrier. Remember, we're going to talk about it in a minute, but a cat's carrier is their happy place. That's their secure spot. So he's coming out. He's a little bit interested. And without some knowledge of body language in cats and what it means, that could be misinterpreted, that he's seeking attention. You have to look at the whole picture there with that cat. He's not happy with his environment. He's stressed. He doesn't like it. He doesn't like whoever has come to his cage. He would like to find the nearest exit and leave. This one's a little bit harder to see. You have to really look in that little hole. There he is. Yes. So I think we can all agree that cat is super stressed, right? Right? He's in his hiding box. He is not coming out. And you can barely see that there's a cat in there just for the little bit of white of his eyes that we can see. And every so often he's licking his lips. But what's the first thing that someone is going to do if they approach that cat in that situation? Stick their hand right in that box, right? Oh, it's okay. Let me just go in there and check him out, and I'll introduce myself to him. And how is that cat going to react? Not very well. Because he's given us every cue to say, I am not comfortable. But if we are not listening and we are not paying attention, and we think the only way he can tell us that he's not comfortable is by hissing or scratching, we're forcing him into a situation where that's what he has to do. But in a different environment, he might be a lot more comfortable. How familiar does this picture look? So, until you know better, you don't do better, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. So before I got into fear-free, and I look back on some of the things of my earlier days in veterinary medicine, and am not very proud of some of the things that we did because we just didn't know. But I remember working in the emergency setting, and gosh, cats that did this used to bother the heck out of our staff. Because they would get the cage all nice and clean and get it set up for the cat, and 5 minutes later they would come back and the water dish is knocked over and there's litter in the food and the cat is under the paper, and oh my gosh, why is this cat doing this to me? So what would the staff do? Take the cat out and put everything back the way it was supposed to be, right? The way we want it to be. This cat is so stressed that it has no other place to go to hide, so it has created its own den. If there's only one thing that you take away from my talk today, is make sure that cats, in whatever facility you are working in, have a place to hide. Because they desperately, desperately need it. That is their safe place. And otherwise they will do something like this. They will become disruptive, which weakens what? That human-animal bond that we have with them as we work with them and are trying to place them to homes. And what's going to happen when they go into a home if they've discovered that they can do destructive behavior to deal with their stress? What's going to happen in that house? Right. Is that cat going to stay long in that house? Probably not. We're lucky if it comes back, right? And not just open the back door and say, you got to go. Does anybody recognize this type of a picture? I'm sure you guys never see an animal like this. I mean, this is, right, the classic stressed cat. So how do we go from that to this? That's the same cat, by the way. Change of environment, changing some things around him, and he turned into this guy. I'm not saying it's going to happen overnight, but it can happen. So how do we start bringing fear-free into a shelter setting? Because trust me, I know what you guys are thinking. This is all well and good, and it looks really good on a computer slide and a screen, but how do we do it in real life? And again, it's really important for me that you guys know that I understand the real world happens. While I was not a shelter veterinarian, I did work in the real world, and I know that not everything fits into a beautiful box like I would think it would. So if there's little things that can be done, it's better than nothing. So it starts with intake and admission, which can be really stressful, not just for the animals coming in, but for the people bringing them in as well. So looking at the intake and admission system in place, and even the environment that the animals are coming into, and taking a step back and really observing it from the animal's point of view. I think oftentimes we get in our head and we look at it from what people want it to look like and what's most efficient for us and what works from us from a business standpoint or running a shelter standpoint. And we don't think about what the animals are seeing and hearing and feeling. We can't remove every source of stress, but we can certainly try to reduce it. Some things to consider, and this is not always feasible, but if it is, having separate entrances for where the public are bringing animals in and where animal control may be bringing animals in, to keep those two populations separate if possible. For feral cats that are coming in, having a specific drop zone for them. Ideally, this is a room that is kept dark, that is kept quiet, that is definitely away from barking dogs. Definitely recommend using pheromones in that space so that those cats, their FAS starts to come down immediately. Additionally, thinking about what are the animals standing on when they come in the intake and admission area? Do we have dogs standing on a slippery floor? Can we put something down to make them stand a little bit easier so that they're not worried about their legs going out from under them. It can be as simple as buying really cheap yoga mats or buying a bath mat. So something for them to stand on. And then, like I said, take a step back and listen to what's going on in that intake area. What can you hear? Do you constantly hear phones ringing? Is there an overhead paging system that's constantly going off? Are there dogs barking? What can you do to mask some of that sounds if getting rid of them is not an option? Can we play music, preferably not rock or rap, but maybe something classical or species-specific or even nature sounds to help? We want to set the tone for when they come in to be more positive. How many are doing scheduled intakes at their facilities? Okay. So I get it, it's not always feasible, right? If it is, consider it. Consider making that time, if you know ahead of time that someone is going to be relinquishing an animal, that they have a scheduled time to bring that animal in. Not only does it kind of make it less stressful, there's less hustle and bustle in that moment, but you can actually sit down with the person that's bringing that animal into your facility and spend some time with them. Now, not everyone wants to do that. They may just want to be like, here, I can't deal with this is too much for me. But if they are open to a few-minute conversation, it'll get you some vital information that you need. It allows that animal to kind of settle down with that familiar person still with them. And it shows a level of compassion and empathy to that person that they will remember, because that's a tough situation for everyone. And we want to try to make it stress-free for them as much as we can as well. So once the animal is in, we want to give them time to adjust. Studies show that cats can take anywhere from 15 to 30 minutes to adjust to a new environment. And we're often not very respectful of that time frame. Why? Because we have things to do. Like I said, cats are comfortable in their carriers, so if it is possible to have them stay in the carrier that they came in, try to do that. Try to let them adjust to their new environment while they're still in something that makes them feel safe and secure. Put a pheromone-sprayed towel over their carrier so that they're breathing in those happy pheromones. Remember that emotional contagion? If they're breathing in happy pheromones, what's going to happen to their emotions? They're going to come up to meet that, right? Same thing with dogs. If they come in a carrier, try to see if they can stay in that carrier. Make sure that dogs come in on a leash. I know you guys are preaching to the choir on that one, right? Make sure that they also, though, have time to adjust to their environment. Let them sniff, let them check things out before we're rushing them through to the next spot that's foreign and different for them. So much of what I've talked about really relates to the environment, and we want to make sure that we're providing all of those things. We want to make sure that the animals have comfy bedding, right? That we're using pheromones, that we're doing calming music, that we're making sure they have enough space that they're adjusting. What about that human-animal bond that we know has a positive impact on them and on us? So there was this great study by Hennessy and team in 2020, and they looked at two sets of dogs. They had dogs that were at home, and they had dogs in a shelter. And they drew blood from them and checked their cortisol levels. Remember that stress hormone, right? Not a surprise. The dogs that went into the shelter, cortisol level was higher. It was about 3 times the cortisol level of the dogs that were in their home. Not surprising. What was surprising was that cortisol level stayed that high for 3 days after they got into the shelter. So they're just at that high stress factor. They are fight or flight or freeze the entire time, those first 72 hours. Another study actually said it could take up to 10 days for that level to come down. So we need to be vigilant about what is happening in those first couple of days, because that sets the tone and it's going to start creating pathways in their brain to lay down behavior changes. And it's things that we can do for them to change that. So great. They proved that the dogs were more stressed in the shelter. Okay. So then they took those shelter dogs and they kept them in their kennel setting, and they introduced a predetermined amount of petting per day. They had a person come by, spend some time with the dog at their shelter, at their kennel, and pet them. And then they checked their cortisol levels. And they came down, not a ton, but they did come down. Where it got really interesting was then they took those same dogs and moved them to a different location in the shelter and made that location more comfortable for them. It was quiet. It was away from other animals. It was more settled. And they spent 20 minutes with them. So gave them time to adjust to the area, and the person just hung out in the room with them. It didn't matter if the person was touching them, they were just in the room with them. Those dogs' cortisol levels dropped significantly compared to the other dogs. So it's not just the environmental changes, it's the social interaction with people, and it's that combination together that really seems to impact. So I think you should house a person in every kennel with every dog, obviously. It's the only solution I see here. Just write to Marty Becker and ask him for a check, and he'll take care of that for you. Now, obviously, that is not feasible. But it does give you food for thought, right? What can we do? I know a lot of facilities have volunteers coming in to spend time with the dogs. But think about, where are they spending time with them? Do we need to adjust that environment? Do we need to adjust the time frame that they're spending with them? Are we giving the animals enough time to adjust? And maybe they just need somebody to be hanging out with them. They don't necessarily need to go potentially for a walk, although that's great. But maybe what works for one dog doesn't work for another. Can you use foster programs that allow dogs to leave the shelter for a night and go to someone's home and spend some time in a comfortable setting? What impact would that have on their long-term health if we started doing that? Would it decrease some of those behaviors that are causing them to be returned? Great. So what does that mean long-term for these pets, right? As we talked about, we have higher return rates for pets that have behavior issues. In a study in 2020 from a team, they looked at the reasons why dogs and cats were being returned, and they looked at about 100 dogs and about 70 cats. Almost 40% of the dogs were returned due to aggression, and over half of the cats were brought back due to personal reasons. When they dove into that a little bit more, it was behavioral issues that the owners found to be intolerable within their home. So again, we see behavior is a symptom. It's a symptom of stress that they're introduced to that creates changes within their brain, that lays down behavior changes that they think they have to use to adapt when they're stressed. So what could we do for them if they're not stressed? How would that look for their future? Additionally, we can look at this study that looked at the impact of social interactions as well as training. So this group kind of took what that other study did, but they added in some positive training within the shelter setting. And what that means really is just creating positive emotions around the shelter setting. So it can be as simple as dog gets treats when it's in its kennel, when it approaches the door, creates a positive interaction with that setting. We set up areas that are fun for them. They have enrichment. They have social interaction with people. And again, those that had that versus those that did not had a more successful time being adopted and less chance of coming back to the shelter. What I think is really interesting is that the behavior of a pet is more attractive or more important to a potential adopter than what the pet looks like. Which is interesting, because how do we try to promote pets out for adoption? How they look, right? It's like Tinder, but for animals. It's like swiping through. Right? We all do it. We're like, oh, that dog is so cute. I mean, it's the Sarah McLachlan commercial in the background with the dog looking so sad. But in the reality of it, it's their behavior. So let's promote that. Let's work on that. Let's help them adjust and create a positive interaction so that when people do come to see them, they see what they're going to get when they take it home. Fear-free is way more than just providing comfy bedding and giving treats. I always tell people we're more than peanut butter and spray cheese. We actually do want to make a difference in these animals, although I like peanut butter and spray cheese. It's really, really looking at changing environments. And shelter pets are they're at such risk for this chronic stress and these behavior changes. And we really want to change that narrative. We want to change those behaviors that we're seeing. And that way they can live long, happy, healthy lives. So fearfreeshelters.com, as I mentioned, our Fear-Free Shelter program is completely free. If you have not taken it, I highly encourage you to take it. Share it with those at your facilities. It is free to rescues, to fosters, to volunteers, to all shelters. We have some great additional resources on there as well. If you want to go further in depth, fearfree.com. And then Fear-Free Happy Homes is our pet owner website. There's lots of really good information on there. Fear-Free has partnered with Shelters United in the last year to create toolkits for adopters to take home so that they can be aware of behavioral issues in their pets and work with them to reduce that stress, that fear, and that anxiety. Again, huge thank you to Michigan Pet Alliance. Thank you guys for letting me be a Buckeye here in the state of Michigan for a day, and I'm happy to answer questions.
What's your opinion on the overnight stays and lessening the cortisol? Like when they get returned the
Are they
next
gonna
day,
spike back
it
up?
just spikes back up.
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, absolutely. So the question was with overnight stays out of the shelter, and then when they come back into the shelter the next day, is their cortisol level going to spike back up? And I think that that's an excellent question. I think it's a combination. I don't think we can do one or the other. Like, I don't think if you're not making any adjustments within the shelter to create a positive environment for them when they're there, I think you have to do that in combination with letting them do some overnight stays. The goal is that if we're making those changes in the shelter, that they have adapted in a positive way and not developed bad behaviors during that time, that even going out for a night and coming back, they shouldn't spike as high. It should be kind of like a normal, my anxiety for the last 30 seconds before I come on stage, like my body adjusts and we go back down, right? Like, it should be like that.
It's a good question.
Great question.